Hey there, survivors. Thanks for tuning in to tonight's episode. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. It really helps me keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, let's get started. Someone once said that sound travels farther when the world is quiet. Out there, past the mountains and the dead cities, past the ruins of nations, and the echo of what used to be. I like to think that someone somewhere is still listening. Maybe a kid with a scavenged radio rig tucked inside an overturned school bus. Maybe a woman camped in a burned-out lighthouse, her fire kept alive by driftwood and old newspapers. Maybe just anyone who remembers what a voice in the dark used to mean. My name is Rowan Chambers, and this voice, this station, has been broadcasting for 30 years from beneath the cold soil near Colorado Springs. Once this place hummed with activity, technicians, security teams, botanists, and cooks and engineers, all hand-picked to serve a billionaire named Gordon High Toe Tower, who built this underground sanctuary not as a retreat, but as a backup plan for the end of the world. Most of them are gone now. Some left when they couldn't take the silence. Some vanished without a word. Others never made it back from supply runs. What's left of humanity exists in fragments like the pieces of a broken mirror reflecting a world that barely resembles the one we lost. I didn't plan to be here. I was a systems engineer with a degree, a sister I adored, and zero desire to join an apocalypse club. But the high tower paid well, and the work was clean. My sister Meredith came on later as part of the greenhouse staff. We thought it would be a few months of easy money. Then the first wave hit. The spore swept through cities like smoke. The dead didn't just rise. They evolved, shifted, learned to wait, to blend in. By the time the air turned dangerous and the radio started falling silent, we were already locked inside. Now it's just me in this forgotten echo chamber. Each night I switch on the transmitter, adjust the gain, and speak into the void. I share warnings, maps, the names of people I haven't heard from in years. I talk about the vaccine we almost had, about the nuclear fires that carved glowing scars into the earth, about how we came this close to turning it all around and then sabotaged ourselves. I always wait for a voice to answer, and every time the silence returns, I wonder how long I can keep pretending that I'm doing this for someone else, and not just to hear my own voice so I can remember I'm still human. Long before this began, I lived a normal life in Seattle. Back then, I was fresh out of college, armed with a degree in mechanical engineering. I was a typical young professional, carrying ambitions that had nothing to do with survival or bunkers. My sister Meredith was finishing a course in environmental science at the time. Her passion was always ecology and the outdoors. She loved analyzing soil samples, discovering new species of wildflowers, and creating pressed collages out of dried petals. Our parents had both passed away when we were teenagers, leaving us to rely on each other as we navigated adulthood. We found ways to support one another, forging a sibling bond that shaped most of our decisions. In early 2027, when the economy seemed stable enough, I moved to Colorado for work on a private construction project. The location near Cheyenne Mountain was rumored to be highly secure. The rumor turned out to be true. It was indeed a subterranean fortress commissioned by Gordon High Toe Tower, a man known for uncanny foresight and nearly limitless wealth. I landed a job as part of the initial installation crew for the facility's water reclamation and ventilation systems. Meredith followed soon after, initially just visiting me, but she ended up staying when Hightower offered her a position in the domestic staff. The pay was generous, the environment controlled, and we had the sense that we were participating in some elaborate precaution, one that would hopefully never be needed. At the time, the notion of global collapse felt unimaginable, at least for me. My biggest concerns involved finishing each engineering phase without missing deadlines. I'd spend long days in the subterranean levels, aligning the filtration tanks, calibrating sensors, and ensuring that the ventilation shafts were sealed properly against any outside contamination. Occasionally, I'd see Hightower himself roaming the halls with a sense of measured curiosity. He'd nodded at me in passing, perhaps inspecting the progress of his doomsday refuge. Rumors about why the Hightower wanted such a massive bunker varied. Some said he feared a nuclear exchange between superpowers. Others believed he was preparing for catastrophic climate changes. No one, to my knowledge, mentioned zombies. Yet, when the earliest signs of an infection started appearing on the news in mid-2028, Hightower's project was already 90% complete. He quietly accelerated the final stages, increasing the pay to double time with some teams working around the clock. By the time the outbreak reached major U.S. cities, the bunker was fully operational. At first, the outbreak was just another piece of sensational news. People assumed it would stay confined, that the CDC would swoop in with a rapid containment plan. But then, entire counties in Texas went dark within weeks. Reports from Memphis, Tennessee emerged next, describing people falling ill with a fungal infection that spread unbelievably fast. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Government briefings warned the public not to panic, claiming the situation was under control. None of us could have guessed how quickly it would spiral into a worldwide event. I remember the exact day that Gordon High Tow Tower summoned all his staff to the central lounge on sublevel 1. It was a chilly morning in November 2028. We had only just heard that the infection, this zombie spore, as they were calling it on social media, had infiltrated the outskirts of Los Angeles. Hightower stood at the front of a large meeting room, wearing an impeccably tailored suit, explaining that the bunker would lock down for an indefinite period. He displayed news footage from various channels, images of overcrowded airports, lines of vehicles on every major highway, police forces trying to establish quarantine perimeters. It was chaos on every screen. People stared in disbelief, as if we'd stumbled into a disaster film. Hightower announced he would keep us safe, provided we all performed our designated roles and did not attempt to leave without explicit clearance. In the months that followed, the world above changed in ways we could scarcely process. Governments declared national emergencies. Martial law was instated in certain regions, and attempts to isolate the infection largely failed because it spread in unpredictable ways. The spore was airborne under certain conditions, but experts also suspected contamination through direct contact with fluids. Even as the authorities struggled to contain it, they faced riots, supply chain disruptions, mass migrations, and the growing presence of infected. Within the bunker, the Hightower established a strict regime. We had weekly drills for sealing off different levels in case of a breach. We wore specialized ID badges that granted or restricted access to certain areas. A squad of ex-military personnel ensured the bunker's security both internally and above ground. They coordinated short, carefully planned trips outside to gather supplies, retrieve specialized equipment, or scout the immediate perimeter. Through all this, I tried to focus on my engineering tasks, maintaining the water purification system, running diagnostics on the air filtration modules, and verifying that the power generators were stable. The bunker had multiple generators, some running on natural gas, others capable of burning diesel if necessary, and a substantial battery array. Redundancy was built into every system. At night, we'd gather in a small lounge to watch news broadcasts from around the world. Initially, there were still active reporters, albeit in protective gear, standing in front of blockaded streets or overwhelmed hospitals. Then those feeds became increasingly sporadic. Some networks simply went offline. Others broadcast older footage on a loop, their anchors gone. It was around this time that alternative voices began cropping up on shortwave frequencies. Ordinary people broadcasting from the basement, attics, or improvised shelters described the collapse of their communities. We'd listen in stunned silence, hearing these pleas for help we could not offer. The high tower urged us to conserve resources. We ate freeze-dried meals from the massive storage rooms, saving the fresh produce from our hydroponic garden for special occasions. Everything was measured and tracked. We had ration cards that allowed each person a certain portion per day. Morale was difficult to sustain, especially as the once spacious corridors began to feel claustrophobic. People stuck to their duties, but tensions simmered. Some staff members quietly questioned the ethics of staying locked away while the rest of the world tore itself apart. Others believed we were simply doing what was necessary to survive. I recall the first time I personally ventured above ground after the lockdown. The security team needed someone who understood the ventilation shafts to help clear debris near the main air intake. A powerful windstorm had torn through the property, scattering branches and ripping away protective covers. I accompanied a few guards wearing protective overalls and a respirator. Stepping outside felt like entering another realm. The sky had a muddy tint, as if dust from distant fires hung in the air. Our estate, once immaculately landscaped, was littered with broken tree limbs. In the distance, Colorado Springs was entirely still. For a moment, I almost believed that the city might just be deserted. Then, through a pair of binoculars, I saw figures shuffling along the edge of what used to be a residential zone. The guards advised me not to look too long, so I refocused on clearing the air intake. That initial glimpse of the infected, half a dozen silhouettes drifting aimlessly, burned into my mind. They seemed unthinking, unfeeling, yet unstoppable in their single-minded presence. We managed the bunker operations well enough through the first year. Regular updates came from the White House and the CDC, often urging people to remain calm and follow quarantine guidelines. They insisted that a cure, or at least a treatment, was on the horizon. Yet by the following spring, those official bulletins had ceased. Only pockets of local leadership tried to maintain order, setting up safe zones or clean zones that lasted a few weeks at most before collapsing. Europe fared no better. I remember hearing a final broadcast from the BBC World Service describing how infected mobs had overwhelmed the security cordon around London. The anchor's voice was cut off mid-sentence, replaced by static. Inside the bunker, a certain grim acceptance set in. Hightower, wanting to speed up a solution, assembled a team of infectious disease experts and microbiologists. He placed them in a dedicated lab 2 levels below the main living quarters. They had spore samples kept in negative pressure chambers, painstakingly studying how the fungus attacked the human nervous system. Meredith was assigned to assist them occasionally, sterilizing their equipment, cleaning the lab surfaces. The researchers were guarded in their optimism, but every few weeks they'd announce modest progress. I overheard rumors that they were close to formulating a prototype inhibitor, something that, if delivered early, might prevent new infections from taking hold. The potential for a vaccine glimmered like a distant beacon of hope. Over time, the outside transmissions turned darker. Survivors spoke of enclaves forming around certain well-defended locations. We heard tales of a large group near Flagstaff that had sealed off a canyon and fortified it with makeshift walls. They broadcast instructions for other survivors, encouraging them to join. Then, abruptly, their station went silent. Another group claimed to operate out of the Rocky Mountains, using the high altitude to their advantage, but they too vanished from the airwaves within months. Rumors of cannibalistic raiders started circulating. The subject was delicate. Few people dared to admit that the resource shortage had driven them to such extremes, but the anecdotes persisted. Individuals described traveling families that were lured into safe-looking shelters only to discover they'd stumbled into the lair of people with no other source of sustenance. High tower scientists pushed forward, driven by these horrifying stories. They believed that the pressure of a worldwide catastrophe could be channeled into medical breakthroughs, that necessity was the mother of invention. The scale of their ambition was impressive, but eventually it became clear that the environment itself was against them. The spore was more adaptable than they realized. They'd tweak a chemical compound only to discover that the fungus mutated in response. The early prototypes of their inhibitor turned out to have side effects that were nearly as unsettling as the infection itself, causing neurological disturbances in lab animals that mirrored the aggression of the infected. Even so, they persevered. By the third year underground, the number of people in the bunker began to dwindle. Some left, convinced they could survive more comfortably by joining existing enclaves or forging their own path. A few discovered family members who were still alive on the outside and felt obliged to reunite with them. Not everyone made it back. We'd see small search parties depart, only to return with fewer members, or sometimes not at all. The security detail that accompanied them did its best, but the infected were relentless, and the surface world offered little safety. At one point, a staff member named Isaac took it upon himself to explore Colorado Springs, hoping to confirm rumors that parts of the city center had been retaken by a local militia. He carried a battered radio, promising to check in daily. For a while, he did. He described finding a few survivors holed up in a library near East Pikes Peak Avenue, living off old canned goods. Then one evening, his updates stopped. Days passed with no word. Eventually, we wrote him off as another casualty of this nightmare. Meanwhile, inside the bunker, routine tasks offered structure. Every morning we performed system checks on water recycling, greenhouse operations, and generator fuel levels. The greenhouse had a modest yield: lettuce, tomatoes, peppers, and some herbs. We never produced enough for lavish meals, but it supplemented our stored supplies with essential nutrients. Meredith grew adept at handling the delicate chemistry of hydroponic solutions, ensuring our plants stayed healthy. She recorded observations in a thick notebook, noting changes in leaf coloration or signs of nutrient deficiencies. Her diligence likely saved off scurvy and other nutritional problems that might have plagued us. The psychological weight of living underground was tremendous. People coped in various ways. Some maintained exercise routines in the small gym on sublevel 2. Others read books from High Tower's extensive library, losing themselves in fiction that recalled a time before the infection. A few found solace in the chapel-like room near the back of the facility where they'd sit quietly, reflecting on whatever faith or beliefs they held. I often lost myself in the radio console, scanning frequencies for any signs of life. Some nights I'd pick up faint transmissions in foreign languages, snatches of Russian, Spanish, or what might have been Mandarin, indicating that pockets of survivors endured across the globe. But the signals were always weak and short-lived. Year 4 brought the sabotage that shattered our hopes for a cure. It happened on a Thursday night. Alarms blared through the bunker and red emergency lights pulsed in the corridors. Word spread that the microbiology lab had been compromised. When security arrived, they found the lead scientist unconscious or missing. Vital research data destroyed, and vials of spore cultures spilled. A thick haze of containment foam filled the lab, sealing off potential airborne threats. No one admitted responsibility. Perhaps it was an inside job, or an outside agent who had infiltrated the bunker through unknown means. The result was catastrophic. The research, which had taken years to compile, was mostly gone. Some staff members tried to recover partial data from backup drives, but essential files were missing. The team's momentum vanished. In the aftermath, morale hit a new low. Some staff members, convinced that there was no longer a reason to stay, simply walked out of the bunker. Hightower raged, calling their departures an act of betrayal. Eventually, even he seemed to lose his fire. He locked himself in his private quarters, emerging only sporadically. A rumor circulated that he blamed himself for not investing in even tighter security, or for trusting people who might have turned against him. Beyond our walls, the global situation only worsened. Major cities across continents were overrun. Nuclear strikes at various points left swaths of land heavily irradiated. People described an eerie glassy terrain around some of these blast sites where almost nothing lived. In the weeks after each explosion, transmissions from those regions would speak of mutated, infected, sporting fungal growths that gave them a hardened appearance. Some survivors referred to these as armored lurkers, as they could withstand more conventional deterrents. Yet, the nuclear apocalypse many had feared never fully came to pass. There were enough stable enclaves left in the chain of command around the world to realize that mutual destruction would finish what the spore started. So the bombs ceased. The consequence was a patchwork of radioactive zones scattered across the earth like wounds on a body. Travel between these zones was perilous at best, impossible at worst. By year 7, I found myself drifting through the bunker in a few days. So many vacant bunks, empty storage lockers, and half-abandoned corridors. The once frequent staff meetings gave way to a loose arrangement of people simply doing their tasks without question. The Hightower rarely showed his face. Meredith and I stuck together, supporting each other as best we could. My daily routine involved a deep system check in the mornings, greenhouse oversight in the afternoons, and radio watch in the evenings. On the radio, I broadcast messages encouraging survivors to share any knowledge of stable regions or new scientific breakthroughs. Mostly, I was met with silence. Occasionally, a voice would crackle through the static, offering a rumor of hope before fading away. Then came the day the Hightower disappeared. It was sudden, with no official announcement. The security cameras captured him walking toward an emergency exit with 2 guards. They all carried backpacks, the door sealed behind them, and no one saw them again. We found no notes in his quarters, just an empty office and a closet with missing clothes. The staff, already stretched thin, splintered without his presence. Some argued that they should attempt to locate him. Others decided it was time to leave for good. In the span of a few weeks, half of those remaining departed. Soon it was just me, Meredith, and a handful of others. Amid this new isolation, we reorganized the living areas, consolidating to a smaller section of the bunker to save on power. We shut down entire wings, turning off lights and sealing doors to conserve energy. The greenhouse and the radio room remained our primary focus. We rigged up an alarm system that would alert us if any door to the outside world was opened. We carried on in that manner for several more years. In that time, the outside broadcasts I managed to catch painted a varied picture of humanity's attempt at survival. A cluster of survivors in Canada claimed to have built a functioning settlement in an old hydroelectric dam. Farmers in the Midwest described small communities where they grew corn and kept livestock behind tall fences. Rumors of cannibal tribes persisted, especially in areas where resources were scarce. People told stories about a group in the ruins of Chicago that systematically preyed on travelers. No official name was given, but they were described as an organized band that had taken over some of the high-rises and turned them into traps for unsuspecting wanderers. The infected, meanwhile, continued to roam. Decay did not appear to stop them completely, as the spore seemed to animate their bodies in ways that defied normal decomposition rates. Some gleaned that the infected might be feeding on the spore's own growth cycles, effectively preserving their forms. A few enclaves attempted to burn large waves of infected, but each effort required significant resources and put survivors at risk of spore exposure through airborne ash. The problem always came back to the spore's resilience. Years 10 through 15 passed in a blur of monotony. Our bunker population dwindled further. People left for one reason or another, convinced that perhaps a better life waited outside. We'd see them off at the main hatch, handing over rations and any gear we could spare. Sometimes we'd hear back from them via radio, describing small victories or tragedies. Eventually, those updates became less frequent until they stopped entirely. Day to day, my existence revolved around the mechanical hum of the generator, the drip of the water purification system, the faint glow of greenhouse lamps. Meredith and I found what comfort we could in each other's company, though we rarely spoke of the future. She poured her energy into perfecting crop yields, testing different hydroponic setups, trying to cultivate beans or microgreens to boost our dietary variety. One day, she confided in me that she worried about losing her sense of purpose in this enclosed world. The isolation weighed on her. We'd take short walks through the bunker's upper corridors, sometimes shining flashlights into dusty rooms that once bustled with staff. I'd catch glimpses of old memos on desks or personal items left behind, family photos, books, trinkets. It often made me reflect on the ephemeral nature of everything we once considered normal. The outside world also kept changing. On the radio, I once heard about a traveling caravan near the Great Lakes region that had formed a floating community aboard a series of improvised rafts and boats. They claimed the infected were less likely to venture into open water, and the spore itself struggled to spread in environments with strong currents. Another broadcast from Eastern Europe told of small fortress towns rising behind medieval-era walls. People found that ancient fortifications, if repaired, could provide a measure of security. Yet each outpost existed in a precarious balance, threatened by roving hordes or infiltration from within. The most unsettling rumors involved so-called ferals, heavily mutated infected that seemed to develop new behaviors. Some travelers insisted these creatures could remain still for days, mimicking real corpses. Others said they huddled in groups as if waiting to ambush prey. Several enclaves reported that the ferals used faint vocalizations, a kind of mimicry that approximated the sound of living humans. Survivors who investigated such calls sometimes never returned. I couldn't verify these stories, but enough identical accounts surfaced from unconnected sources to lend them credibility. By year 20, the bunker's daily routine had been refined to a near ritual. I rose at a consistent hour, my wristwatch still functioning thanks to careful battery management, and went through a mental checklist. Generator fuel, water tank levels, greenhouse water pH, filters in the ventilation system. Meredith and I rotated the tasks to keep ourselves engaged. Every evening, I'd return to the radio console and broadcast. Sometimes I'd talk about practical tips, how to scavenge from old grocery stores without risking exposure, how to test water for contamination, or how to identify if an infected person might be lying in wait. On nights when I felt a spark of optimism, I'd recount childhood memories or read passages from an old guide to engineering fundamentals, hoping that knowledge might benefit someone. Rarely did I get a reply. The static was constant, interrupted only by fleeting signals. Despite everything, I clung to the possibility that we might one day find a safe zone or rejoin a community of like-minded survivors. Meredith was less vocal about it, but sometimes I'd see her reading through the notebook she kept of horticultural breakthroughs. I suspected she harbored dreams of helping restore farmland on the surface, perhaps collaborating with others to rebuild a stable settlement. We never made firm plans, though. The idea of leaving the bunker still felt overwhelming, with infected raiders lurking in every corner of the surface. The day the security system beeped unexpectedly, indicating an attempted entry through a rarely used vent, was a turning point. We rushed to the monitor station, scanning the external cameras. One camera near the estate's perimeter fence showed vague movement in the brush. We couldn't make out details, but something large was scraping near the vent covers. The motion abruptly stopped. Perhaps it was just an animal or the wind. Still, the unsettling realization was that the outside world was encroaching on us again. We double-checked the seals and replaced the external vent covers with heavier grates. Around the 25th year, the bunker's population had reduced to a handful. Me, Meredith, a radio operator named Nigel, who specialized in shortwave communication, and Fairbanks, one of the last remaining security officers. Together, we tried to maintain the essential systems. Nigel had a knack for tuning into distant frequencies, sometimes picking up signals from as far as the East Coast. He described one such signal from a group calling themselves the Riverland Federation, claiming to occupy territory around the Mississippi. They had farmland, a rudimentary militia, and limited technology to broadcast on shortwave. It sounded promising, even if we doubted that strangers would be welcomed easily. Fairbanks, for his part, believed in forging alliances. He argued that isolating ourselves in the bunker was unsustainable long-term. Fuel for the generators was finite and essential parts would wear out eventually. Nigel agreed. They proposed that we attempt contact with the Riverland Federation or other enclaves, perhaps forging a relationship that could lead to mutual support. Meredith was hesitant, concerned about the hazards of travel and the risk of infection. I vacillated, torn between the safety of the bunker and the knowledge that we couldn't hide forever. Nigel tried sending out messages addressed specifically to the Riverland Federation, referencing the coordinates we had gleaned from their transmissions. Over the course of a few weeks, we heard nothing in response. Then, surprisingly, a faint voice broke through the static late one night. It claimed to be from a settlement near Breenage, though not the Riverland Federation. The person, who introduced himself as Sam Torres, said they'd formed a small community in the mountains, relying on hunting, fishing, and greenhouse operations similar to ours. They were open to meeting other survivors if safe travel could be arranged. Fairbanks latched on to this possibility with zeal. After weeks of planning, Fairbanks and Nigel decided to gather a few supplies, head for Breenage, and see for themselves if this was a viable community. They invited us to join. Meredith and I hesitated, concerned about the risks. In the end, we declined, preferring the bunker's security despite the isolation. Fairbanks assured us he'd send updates by radio along their journey. The morning they left, we helped them load a battered SUV Hightower had kept in the surface garage. We parted ways with a sense of heavy finality, watching them drive off through the estate grounds. They signaled on the radio for the first day, describing relatively open roads with scattered infection. Then on the second day, they reported making good progress. On the third day, we lost their signal altogether. We never heard from them again. Their departure left the bunker emptier than ever. It was just me and Meredith, now heading into the 28th year. We continued as best we could. I upgraded the greenhouse lights to more energy-efficient LEDs, scavenged from the facility's remaining supplies. We rationed fuel for the generator, shutting it down during certain hours and relying on battery power. We sealed off even more of the bunker's unused sections to minimize maintenance. The radio broadcast continued. Each night I explained who we were, where we were, and offered to share any knowledge gleaned over the decades. Occasionally, a faint burst of static would sound like a human voice, but I couldn't pass it. I clung to hope, meticulously logging times and frequencies, trying each night to reconnect. Then Meredith disappeared. That morning, I went to wake her in her quarters, expecting to see her reading over greenhouse notes. Instead, her bed was untouched. Her personal belongings were in their usual place, her clothes folded, her old notebook with pressed flowers near the lamp. She was simply gone. There was no sign of forced entry, no note pinned to the door. The bunker cameras had been malfunctioning for some time, so I couldn't trace her steps. I searched every corridor, calling her name. I checked the upper levels, the sealed exit hatches, every storage room. She was nowhere to be found. Days turned to weeks, and she did not return. The thought that she might have slipped out to the surface lingered. Maybe she had grown tired of waiting for me to make the decision to leave. Perhaps she believed she could find a better life elsewhere, or even had some lead on our missing colleagues. The uncertainty weighed on me. Without her, the bunker felt even more oppressive. Each footstep echoed in the vacant hallways. The greenhouse seemed silent without her thoughtful observations. I had never felt so truly alone, determined not to let despair consume me. I pressed on with the radio broadcasts. The entire weight of the bunker's upkeep now fell on me. Day in and day out, I tested water quality, replaced air filters, harvested what few vegetables grew in the greenhouse, and struggled to maintain the generator. The silence around me was overwhelming. Sometimes I found myself talking to the walls, narrating my tasks like a public service announcement just to fill the emptiness. As time trudged closer to the 30th year, I came to terms with the fact that I, too, could not stay here forever. Supplies like medical gauze, disinfectants, and certain trace minerals for the hydroponic system were running low. A catastrophic failure of any major subsystem could render the bunker uninhabitable. I considered traveling north, having heard occasional rumors of safer stretches near the Canadian border. The climate there might slow the infected, and certain enclaves might welcome a mechanically skilled individual. On the other hand, the journey would be treacherous beyond comprehension. In the nights leading up to this final decision, I recorded a series of extended broadcasts. I spoke in detail about what I'd learned of the spore's biology, referencing the notes I salvaged from the sabotaged lab. Although incomplete, they contained valuable tidbits. The fungus's reliance on humid conditions, its vulnerability, albeit partial, to certain chemical agents. I recounted how nuclear detonations had backfired, giving rise to mutated variants in irradiated zones. I addressed the threat of cannibal raiders, cautioning travelers to avoid areas known for predatory groups. In essence, I tried to compile a manual of survival tactics gleaned from decades in a vantage point that, while sheltered, was informed by countless hours of listening to the world's struggle. I also recounted the final days of official governments, how entire nations tried to reestablish themselves. Some attempted to rebuild their capitals, only to find them overrun by the infected. Others tried to resurrect monarchy systems or transitional councils, failing under shortages and constant threats. Now, all that remained were small alliances built on local trust, micro-governments that might survive or crumble at a moment's notice. Each of these broadcasts ended with a personal plea. If anyone can hear me, my name is Rowan Chambers. I've been in the Hightower Estate bunker near Colorado Springs since the beginning of the outbreak. I'm considering leaving soon in search of other survivors. If you have any information about stable communities, possible vaccine projects, or safe routes, please respond. I will keep listening to this frequency as long as I can. The microphone hissed with static. I'd hold my breath, straining to detect any flicker of a response. Time after time, only silence returned. Finally, I resigned myself to the reality that I might not receive an answer. I spent weeks gathering a survival pack, a sturdy backpack, containers of purified water, freeze-dried meals, a compact shortwave radio, medical supplies, a multi-tool, and any other items that might prove vital. I even disassembled a small battery array to create a portable power bank for the radio. A part of me realized that leaving the bunker meant never seeing it again, or at least never returning under the same conditions. I might have to seal the doors behind me to prevent infection from wandering in, or if I left it open, perhaps future survivors would find it. Before I left, I wrote a series of notes on the bunker systems, how to operate the generator, how to manage the greenhouse nutrient mix, and how to interpret the filtration system readings. I sealed them in plastic sleeves and placed them in a visible spot near the main console alongside a copy of my recorded broadcasts. If anyone ever stumbled upon the bunker, they'd have the chance to learn from what we built here. Last evening, I did one final system check. The water reclamation tank still held a respectable reserve. The greenhouse lights remained functional, and the backup generator was operational with enough fuel for perhaps another year of moderate usage. Then I made my way to the radio booth. The overhead lamp flickered slightly, a reminder of how old the infrastructure was becoming. I pressed the transmit button. This is Rowan Chambers broadcasting for the final time from the High Tower Estate bunker. To whoever may be listening, I've kept this station on air for nearly 30 years, sharing updates and collecting stories from the world outside. Our resources are nearly spent. I'm preparing to leave in search of a safe haven, or at least a more sustainable life. I'm leaving behind instructions here in the bunker, along with recorded broadcasts that detail everything I know about the infection, the vaccine research we attempted, and the enclaves that once existed. If you find this place and I am gone, may it guide you to survive. Remember that the infected may be relentless, but hope can still exist in pockets of collaboration and compassion. Take care, and if you can keep the signal alive, we must remember who we are even in the face of such overwhelming change. With that, I ended the broadcast, letting the static hum fill the booth. I sat there for a long time, listening for any faint reply. The moments ticked by, each second etched into my memory. Then, at last, I shut down the console. Darkness enveloped the radio booth, broken only by the faint glow of emergency lights. Shouldering my pack, I walked through the bunker's corridors for what I presumed might be the last time. I recalled the faces of the many people who once worked here, the laughter in the cafeteria during the early days, the tense conversations in the lab, the hushed speculation about what was happening above. So many stories had begun and ended in these concrete halls. In the airlock leading to the surface, I paused, placing a hand on the thick steel door. This had been my haven and my prison. On the other side lay an uncertain world, haunted by infected forms, scarred by nuclear devastation, policed by desperate survivors, but perhaps also dotted with enclaves of resilience. Maybe even answers to what happened to my sister, or a final resting place for the regrets I carried. I gripped the lever, took one measured breath, and pushed the door open, stepping into the outside air under a sky I'd hardly seen in nearly 3 decades. The moment the door eased open and the early morning light penetrated the gloom of the airlock, an entirely different reality confronted me. For nearly half my life, the bunker's filtered atmosphere and artificial lighting had defined my world. Now a chill breeze carried scents I had almost forgotten. Pine needles, damp earth, and something sacred that I couldn't immediately identify. Cautiously, I stepped onto the concrete landing that opened onto the estate grounds. The High Tower Estate had once been a manicured landscape, a long driveway bordered by oak trees and rose gardens near the main house. Carefully trimmed hedges that led to a guest cottage. Decades of neglect had rendered it almost unrecognizable. Grasses had grown waist-high. The oak trees, without pruning, had spread their branches wildly, some limbs broken off by storms. A half-collapsed gazebo lay shrouded in vines. I looked for signs of movement, but saw nothing immediately. No wildlife, no infected figures. All was silent, except for the wind rustling leaves. I forced my legs to move, picking a path through the overgrowth, trying to remain vigilant. At the bunker's exit, I donned a protective hooded jacket, secured my respirator over my nose and mouth, and double-checked the filters, though I suspected that the spore wasn't as easily airborne in open spaces unless large numbers of infected were present. Still, caution felt necessary. The air smelled of decay, but not in an overpowering sense, more like the general mustiness of abandoned buildings overlaid with the fragrance of wild plants. My objective that day was to reach the estate's perimeter fence. There, I'd inspect the surroundings and gauge the best route. The estate fence consisted of tall iron bars set in concrete footings, originally designed for privacy and security. Over the years, some sections had rusted or been damaged by falling trees. I recalled that the security staff had used a side gate near a dense patch of forest for their supply runs. That gate would likely be my best exit. As I crossed the yard, I saw the old fountain, once a grand centerpiece of the property. Now it was cracked and partially toppled. Vines crawled over the sculpted stone, reclaiming it for nature. The water that had once cascaded from bronze spouts was gone, replaced by muddy puddles. In the distance, I caught sight of a few shapes that might have been deer or elk. The local wildlife had probably flourished in the absence of human activity, but they scattered before I could take a closer look. When I approached the outer fence, unease welled up. The gate stood ajar, bent off its hinges. I hesitated, scanning the immediate surroundings for any sign of movement. Beyond the fence lay a narrow road once leading up to the mansion's entrance. Beyond that road stretched the broader foothills of the Cheyenne Mountain region, crowned by evergreens and rocky outcrops. Treading carefully, I followed the road downhill. The mansion was located on elevated ground that offered a panoramic view of Colorado Springs, though much of the cityscape was obscured by the curvature of the hills. As I descended, the remains of suburban developments came into view. Roofs poking through a sea of green, roads cracked and buckled. I tried to recall the last official estimates I'd heard about infected density in this area. That was over a decade ago, and any data now would be outdated. Nevertheless, I remained watchful, pausing every few steps to listen for the characteristic shuffling of infected or the distant wails that survivors sometimes reported. Eventually, I found a vantage point near an abandoned gas station. The building's sign was missing letters, leaving only faint outlines. Its windows were broken, and weeds sprouted from cracks in the asphalt. Carefully, I crept around the side, peering in. Empty shelves lined the interior with debris strewn across the floor. No sign of infection, though there were old, dark stains on the linoleum. I refrained from stepping inside, not wanting to risk a hidden threat. Instead, I leaned against the wall to collect my thoughts, occasionally lifting my binoculars to scan the horizon. From this vantage, the city sprawled out below, hushed and gray in the distance, punctuated by the silhouettes of decaying buildings. Some structures had collapsed. Others stood intact but lifeless. Smoke rose in a thin column far off, possibly from a fire or a settlement. I considered heading in that direction, but decided against it for the moment. My plan was to skirt the edges of the city, heading into the foothills. The terrain was rugged with winding roads that sometimes devolved into dirt paths flanked by thick underbrush. The air smelled of pine resin and damp soil. Here and there, wildflowers added splotches of color, offering a striking contrast to the deserted homes. Every so often, I spotted a house tucked away behind pines. Many had broken windows or open doors. Some were partially burned. I didn't investigate most of them, wary of potential infection lurking inside, but curiosity got the better of me at one particular property. It was a modest single-story cabin, its porch sagging, but the roof still intact. The windows were shuttered from the inside. I rapped softly on the door, though I doubted anyone lived there. When no answer came, I pushed it open and stepped inside, shining a flashlight around. Dust particles danced in the beam, and the place had a stale odor of long disuse. A small living area held a couch, a coffee table, and a fireplace with an old charred log. Shelves against one wall contained an assortment of books, mystery novels, a few cookbooks, some travel guides. In the kitchen, I found empty cupboards, a rusted sink. The refrigerator door was ajar, its contents long spoiled. On a table, a yellowed note read, "Gone to find help. If you see this, we are at the Highgate Shelter." The words Highgate Shelter were underlined. There was no date, no further detail. Before leaving, I grabbed a small pot and a can opener from a drawer. You never know when such items might come in handy. I left the note as it was in case someone else came by who might want that information, though it was probably decades out of date. Back on the porch, I gazed at the road ahead, feeling a pang of loneliness. These quiet, empty places were all that remained of so many lives. Late in the afternoon, I heard a noise that made me freeze. A distant scraping sound, like metal dragging on pavement. Quickly, I moved off the road into the tree line, crouching low amidst some shrubs. The scraping came closer. Eventually, a figure came into view, a lone infected, wearing tattered pants and a coat. One sleeve was shredded, revealing an arm twisted at an odd angle. The infected dragged a metal rod or pipe behind it, clinking it against the ground with each step. It wandered aimlessly, occasionally pausing as though trying to sense something. My grip on the straps of my backpack tightened. The figure never turned in my direction, and after a few minutes, it vanished around a bend. Waiting until I felt certain it was gone, I returned to the road. The close call reminded me how vulnerable I was outside the bunker. Even a single infection could be dangerous if it caught me unaware. Its unyielding pursuit, the potential for the spore to spread through a scratch or wound. The respirator might help, but it was no guarantee in the event of a struggle. As night approached, I looked for a place to camp. Sleeping outdoors for the first time in decades felt surreal, especially after living beneath fluorescent lights for so long. I found a spot beneath, a rock overhang sheltered from the wind, and cleared the ground of brush. Using the pot I'd taken, I boiled water from a nearby stream on a small portable stove. The stove was a piece of gear I'd salvaged from the bunker's survival kits. The flicker of the flame dancing against the rocks stirred memories of campouts I'd gone on as a teenager with Meredith. She always loved sleeping under the stars, pointing out constellations, telling me about cosmic events I'd never studied. While the water boiled, I scanned the sky. The stars looked achingly bright, uninhibited by city lights. The Milky Way stretched overhead in a pale band. For a moment, I allowed myself to be transfixed by that cosmic expanse, imagining distant galaxies untroubled by the affairs of Earth. It was a stark reminder of how small and fleeting our crisis must look on the grand scale of the universe. The next morning, I rose with a sense of purpose. My plan was to travel northwest, eventually intersecting what used to be Highway 24. From there, I'd head further west, bypassing Colorado Springs by a significant margin. If I could reach the passes that led toward the towns deeper in the mountains, I might find enclaves, or at least safer terrain. I doubted I'd stumble upon a thriving settlement immediately, but the mountains offered natural barriers against the infected. The cold, especially at higher elevations, had long been rumored to slow them down. Walking along the cracked remains of the highway, I kept an eye out for vehicles that might be salvageable, Most were either rusted heaps or had been stripped for parts long ago. Some lay on their sides as if overturned in the initial panic when people tried to flee. I passed a row of abandoned trucks, their windows broken, cargo compartments empty. Pieces of cloth fluttered in the breeze, caught on jagged edges. An old billboard loomed overhead, advertising a brand of cola that no longer existed. The sign, battered by time, seemed like a monument to a world gone by. On the second day, I encountered my first real challenge. A cluster of infected blocking a stretch of the road. There were perhaps half a dozen standing in the open, their heads turning erratically as if they sensed the environment for movement. Some might call them standard roars. Bodies that no longer showed extreme mutations, but retained that eerie semblance of life. I crouched behind an abandoned sedan, peering over the trunk. Moving closer risked drawing their attention, and my only weapon was a small handgun I had taken from the bunker's armory, plus a crowbar. Engaging so many would be a grave risk. I studied the terrain to see if I could skirt around them. On the left lay a steep embankment with rocky outcroppings. On the right, a dense thicket of trees. I opted for the trees, hoping the infected wouldn't notice my movement. Step by painstaking step, I slipped into the undergrowth, pressing myself low beneath branches. The sunlight filtered in patches through the canopy, illuminating spots of moss and ferns. At one point, my foot snapped a twig and I froze. A moment later, I heard a low moan from one of the infected. I waited. Eventually, their moans subsided, and I inched forward again, mindful of every placement of my boots. After what felt like an eternity, I emerged on the other side, far enough from the cluster that I felt safe returning to the road. All the while, the recollection of that sabotage in the bunker lingered through my mind. The notion that if the scientists had succeeded, maybe such encounters wouldn't be so harrowing now. Perhaps we'd have a real vaccine, or at least an effective prophylactic. But regrets served no purpose at that moment. The infected were here, and I had to navigate around them. As the miles stretched behind me, I saw more evidence of the old world's final days. Clusters of burnt-out houses, partially collapsed strip malls, an empty fire station with graffiti scrolled across its front. Messages like, "Stay away," and "Nothing left," emblazoned on the walls in faded paint. Occasionally, I'd come across human remains, though the dryness of the climate had left them largely skeletal. I tried not to dwell on these remnants, but they underscored the unrelenting toll of the outbreak. On the evening of my third day, I found shelter in a former park ranger station located near the entrance to a national forest. The sign out front was bleached by sun and rain, but I could make out the words, "Pike National Forest Ranger Station." The door was locked. With a bit of force from my crowbar, I managed to pry it open. Inside, I discovered a single main room with old maps pinned to a corkboard, a battered desk, and a couple of metal filing cabinets. Dust lay thick on every surface. A logbook near the desk indicated that meteorologists once staffed the station to track regional weather patterns. The last entries were scrolled lines referencing the initial surge of infected sightings in outlying areas, eventually concluding with abandoned stations heading east. That night, I barricaded the door with a heavy chair and used my portable stove to boil water, rationing my dehydrated meals carefully. I kept my flashlight off to avoid drawing attention, using a candle instead. The flickering light played across the maps, revealing scenic routes that once led hikers to breathtaking vistas. Now those same paths might hold unseen dangers. In the dim glow, I recalled the day Meredith and I first arrived at the bunker, how we teased each other about working for a billionaire's eccentric project, how normal life still felt. The memory lingered, reminding me of how drastically everything had changed. In the morning, I decided to continue deeper into the forest, guided by one of the ranger trails that would eventually lead me north. The station's log suggested that at higher elevations, sightings of infected were rare. I slung my backpack on and stepped back onto the trail, noticing how nature had reclaimed everything. Grass poked through the asphalt, trees overhung the trail, and wild animals roamed freely, unacquainted with the old boundaries of human infrastructure. Along a stretch of winding path, I paused to take in the scenery. Towering pines swayed gently in the breeze, their needles glimmering in the sun. A stream tumbled over rocks just a short distance away, its clear water rushing towards some distant tributary. The sky overhead was a bright canvas of blue, dotted with wispy clouds. It struck me that while the world of humankind had collapsed, the earth itself continued on in its own rhythms. Plants grew, rivers flowed, and wildlife adapted. There was a strange beauty in that realization, as if nature was indifferent to the spore that consumed civilization. Still, I couldn't linger too long in any one spot. Remaining constantly aware of my surroundings, I pressed forward. After a few hours of walking, the trail opened onto a small clearing where a weathered log cabin stood. It had a pitched roof with missing shingles, a stone chimney leaning precariously. Cautiously, I circled the structure, testing for signs of recent activity. Finding none, I ventured inside. The door gave way easily under slight pressure, revealing a single-room interior with a wood-burning stove, a simple bed frame, and a trunk against the wall. Dusty footprints trailed around the space, though it was impossible to tell how old they were. In the trunk, I found a tattered blanket, a lantern with no fuel, and a small journal. Flipping through its pages, I learned that the cabin had belonged to someone named David Mueller, who wrote about escaping the initial chaos in Colorado Springs. He mentioned waiting for a group of friends who never arrived. The entries trailed off abruptly after a mention of going on a hunting trip. It seemed he, too, had vanished into the forest at some point. An ache settled in my mind as I read his final words. I keep waiting for a reply on the radio, but the static is endless. Maybe tomorrow I'll head to the ridge and try the repeater station. There was no further entry. The discovery of David Mueller's journal reminded me of the fragility of every life touched by this crisis. So many stories ended without resolution. Each abandoned home, each scribbled note, offered a glimpse into someone's desperate attempt to endure. I couldn't help but wonder if my own final chapter might be written in similar lines. That night, I stayed in the cabin, lighting a small fire in the stove with the scraps of old furniture. I kept my respirator within arm's reach just in case, and I wrote my own reflections in a notebook I carried. If something happened to me, perhaps another traveler might find it one day. Continuing north, the terrain grew steeper. My progress slowed as I navigated switchbacks, some of which had eroded or collapsed. Occasionally, I encountered wildlife, a fox darting between the trees, a pair of hawks circling overhead. No infection crossed my path for several days, which I took as a hopeful sign. Yet the sense of isolation intensified. The bunker, for all its loneliness, at least offered the comfort of solid walls, electricity, and a regulated environment. Here, every night was uncertain, every noise a potential threat. On the 7th day since leaving the bunker, I spotted what appeared to be fresh footprints near a stream. They were boot prints distinct enough to indicate recent passage, though I couldn't guess how many days old. They led along the bank, heading in the same general direction I was traveling. My attention sharpened. Here was evidence of another living person. Perhaps I'd find an ally or a traveler like myself. Cautiously, I followed the prints for nearly a mile, but then they diverged from my intended path. They cut sharply east, where the terrain dropped into a narrow valley. I debated whether to follow them further, but logic urged me to stay my course. I wasn't equipped for a potentially hostile encounter if these travelers turned out to be dangerous. Instead, I took a mental note of their direction and pressed on. On the 9th day, I discovered a vantage point that provided a sweeping view of a valley below. The forest canopy stretched like an endless carpet, with occasional gaps revealing old roads and the remains of small towns. Using my binoculars, I scanned the horizon. Far off, I noticed a thin plume of smoke rising from what might have been a clearing. It could be a campfire or a settlement. The potential for finding a community warded with the fear of stumbling into danger. In the end, curiosity and the need for human contact won out. I adjusted my route, descending the slopes carefully. By early evening, I was close enough to smell the faint tang of burning wood. No infected were in sight, and the forest grew quiet, as though bracing for nightfall. I approached with extreme caution, weaving between trees until I saw a small encampment. 3 rudimentary shelters made of wood and tarp stood around a fire pit. 2 people sat near the fire, their backs turned to me. A 3rd figure rummaged in a makeshift storage area. My composure wavered, but I forced myself to remain calm. My respirator was in place, though I considered removing it to appear less threatening. Then I reasoned that they might also be wary of infection. After lingering in the shadows for a moment, I decided to reveal myself. I stepped forward, arms slightly raised, to show I meant no harm. One of the individuals by the fire, a man of medium build, clad in a worn jacket, noticed me first. He sprang to his feet, brandishing a hunting rifle. The other person, a woman with a ponytail, also grabbed a weapon, some type of makeshift spear. The figure rummaging in the storage area turned out to be an older man who glanced over, eyes wide. Careful to keep my voice level, I addressed them. "I'm not infected. I was traveling from a bunker near Colorado Springs. I saw your smoke and wanted to see if you'd be willing to talk." The man lowered his rifle slightly, but not entirely. The woman shifted her stance, eyeing me from head to toe, taking in my gear. The older man stepped forward. "We don't want trouble," he said in a hoarse voice. I shook my head. "Neither do I. My name is Rowan." They exchanged glances. Finally, the older man nodded for me to approach. As I drew nearer, I noticed their campsite was basic but relatively organized. A small ring of stones for a fire, a pot suspended over the flames, bedrolls under a tarp. They had a few plastic jugs of water and a large array of gathered mushrooms and plants. The smell of cooking stew wafted from the pot, reminding me how hungry I was for a hot meal. The man with the rifle introduced himself as Beck. The woman was Jana, and the older man, who seemed to be their leader, was Monroe. They'd been living in this region for several months, migrating between known safe spots in the forest. Jana asked if I had a weapon, so I slowly displayed the handgun at my belt. Satisfied that I wasn't brandishing it, they invited me closer to the fire. Over the next hour, we exchanged stories, though cautiously. Beck and Jana had been with a larger group once near a place they called Sunrise Pass. An outbreak of infection forced them to flee. Monroe joined them on the road, bringing knowledge of edible plants and medicinal herbs. They asked about the bunker. I explained the basics, how I'd been there for decades, how almost everyone else had either left or vanished. When I mentioned attempts to create a vaccine, their eyes lit with interest, but I had to admit it never came to fruition. We discussed routes and known dangers. They warned me about a band of hostile people who traveled near certain highways, attacking anyone they perceived as a threat or a source of loot. I recounted my own experiences evading infection and sightings of mutated variants in certain areas. Monroe listened with rapt attention, occasionally jotting notes in a small leather-bound book. He claimed he was compiling a guide for future travelers. At some point, Jana tested the radio equipment in my pack, curious about its range. We couldn't pick up much beyond static. Beck mentioned that they had once received a faint signal from a settlement further north across the state line, but it was too garbled to identify. For a moment, I felt the old spark of hope reminiscent of my bunker broadcasts. Maybe we weren't alone. Maybe other enclaves were forming. Night fell, and they offered me a spot by the fire. I kept my respirator partially on, lifting it occasionally to speak or sip water. Jana seemed puzzled by it, so I explained that I was being cautious about spore inhalation, especially around unknown individuals. She and Beck showed no visible signs of infection, and they insisted they had been tested with older field kits. Still, one could never be certain. I slept fitfully, half expecting either infection or betrayal from my new acquaintances. Dawn arrived without incident. Monroe was up early, quietly tending the fire and flipping through his notebook. He offered me a cup of warm water heated over the coals. I gratefully accepted, letting the warmth steady my nerves. We had a brief conversation about next steps. They planned to head west toward a place Monroe believed might have a water source suitable for permanent settlement. I told them I was moving north, possibly toward rumored enclaves or open terrain near the Canadian border. Beck hesitated, then asked if I'd like to join them. Jana nodded, suggesting that there was strength in numbers. The idea was tempting. After all, traveling alone was risky. Yet I sensed that my path lay elsewhere, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to commit to their plan. Politely, I declined, explaining that I had leads of my own to follow. They seemed disappointed but understanding. Monroe gave me a single page from his notebook, which contained a hand-drawn map marking potential safe spots in the region, mountain cabins, old ranger stations, and water sources. I thanked him, folding it carefully and tucking it away. We parted ways that morning. A brief camaraderie had formed, though we were ultimately strangers with different destinations. The encounter reminded me that not all survivors had resorted to violence or cruelty. Some still sought community, alliances, a future that transcended simple day-to-day survival. Perhaps if I failed to find a better path, I might circle back and look for them. But for now, I kept heading north, guided by the faint hope of discovering a more established settlement. Days blurred together as I navigated the forest and mountainous terrain. Sometimes I found trails or remnants of old logging roads. Other times, I had to bushwhack through dense undergrowth. I rationed my supplies carefully, supplementing them by foraging edible plants and mushrooms. At times, the terrain grew dangerous with steep slopes and loose rock, forcing me to detour around obstacles. One afternoon, as I emerged from a grove of pines, I stumbled onto an old weather station perched on a ridge. It had a small metal tower rising above a squat concrete building. The building's door was sealed with a sturdy lock that looked untouched for years. After some effort, I broke the lock, stepping into a musty interior filled with gauges, monitors, and battered electronics. Dust coated every surface. A logbook near a desk indicated that meteorologists once staffed the station, referencing records that ended around 2029. I poked around, discovering a back room with a small cot and a supply cabinet. In the cabinet were freeze-dried meals, presumably left by the researchers. Though past their printed expiration dates, such rations might still be edible. I tested one, a simple stew mix, by cooking it on my stove. The flavor was bland, but it didn't seem spoiled. Grateful for the boost to my provisions, I took as many pouches as I could carry, leaving some for potential future travelers. Outside, the station's tower offered advantage over the surrounding peaks. Carefully, I climbed the ladder, mindful of rusted bolts. The wind intensified as I reached the top platform, and from there, I marveled at the expansive view. Pine-covered mountains rolled away to the horizon, interspersed with deep valleys. Far to the west, I glimpsed an open plain that might have once been farmland. I tried to imagine where the infected might congregate, but from this height, all looked peaceful, timeless. While descending, an old satellite dish attached to the tower caught my attention. The cables led inside the building. If the station had a power source, maybe the dish could be repurposed to send or receive signals. Intrigued, I spent the rest of the afternoon searching for a generator or any backup system. All I found were rusted components and a single solar panel on the roof, cracked and presumably non-functional. A pity. If I had the right parts, maybe I could have restored it. As it was, I lacked the equipment. Eventually, I departed the weather station, continuing my journey. The next few days passed with relative calm. I managed to avoid any direct encounters with the infected, though I occasionally saw footprints or heard distant moaning that made me detour. Once I found an overturned truck on a narrow road, partially blocking the path. It looked as if it had careened off the mountainside, possibly decades ago. Bones littered the cab along with tattered clothing. The spore's unmistakable grayish residue clung to the seats, a grim reminder of how swiftly life had ended for many. My thoughts drifted off into Meredith, imagining where she might be now. Could she have traveled a similar path, seeking mountain shelter? Or had she gone in an entirely different direction? Perhaps she had found an enclave, or fallen victim to the harshness of the outside. Not knowing was its own kind of torment. I tried to keep her memory alive by pressing forward, telling myself that the only way to honor our shared past was to do something meaningful with the days I had left. Around day 15, I reached a wide valley that, according to an old sign, encompassed a recreational area with campgrounds and a small lake. The sign was riddled with bullet holes, a testament to past conflicts. The lake sparkled in the sunlight, unusually clear. A few cabins dotted the shore, each separated by swaths of pine forest. Eager for a real rest, I decided to investigate one of these cabins for potential shelter. The first cabin I approached was locked tight, but I peered through a window to see that the interior had been ransacked. Furniture was overturned, supplies presumably looted long ago. The second cabin's door was slightly ajar. Inside it appeared mostly intact. A living area with a fireplace, a small kitchenette, and a single bedroom. Leaves had blown in through a broken window, collecting in piles against the walls. The place smelled stale, but not rotted. Checking each corner, I found no immediate threat. The kitchen cupboards were empty, save for a few old canned goods that had rusted beyond use. A closet held some fishing gear, rods, hooks, lines, and a tackle box. This piqued my interest. Perhaps I could fish in the lake, adding protein to my dwindling supply of rations. Carefully, I carried the gear outside, where I found a small rowboat half submerged by the shore. Over the next hour, I managed to haul it onto dry land and inspect the hull for damage. It was waterlogged, but I thought with some patching and drying, it might be serviceable. Encouraged by the prospect, I spent the remainder of the afternoon repairing the rowboat. Using parts of an old sign and resin I'd found in a tool shed behind the cabin, I sealed the cracks as best I could. I left it near the water's edge to dry, then returned to the cabin. That evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, I gathered firewood, carefully sweeping out the fireplace before lighting a small flame. The warmth and glow reminded me of the times I'd done the same in the bunker's rec room. Though that fireplace was gas-powered, sitting there in the flickering light, my thoughts roamed across the entire arc of the outbreak. Decades of living underground had shaped me into someone I barely recognized, someone whose primary concern was surviving day by day rather than the big dreams I once held. But perhaps that was part of humanity's adaptation. Even in the face of unimaginable change, we find ways to keep going. I took out my notebook and documented the day's events, adding details about the lake, the boat, the fishing gear. If anyone found this place after me, perhaps it would serve as a useful record. The next morning, I carried the patched rowboat to the water. Pushing off carefully, I sat in the boat and tested for leaks, scanning the surface for signs of life. The lake was still, reflecting the surrounding pines and the clear sky like a mirror. At the center, I tossed a fishing line overboard, waiting with silent anticipation. My initial attempts yielded nothing. Just when I considered returning to shore, the line tugged. A brief struggle ensued, culminating in the capture of a small trout. It was a modest catch, but it filled me with a sense of triumph. For the first time since leaving the bunker, I felt something approaching joy. I rowed back to land, prepared the fish using the skill set I'd learned from old survival guides, and cooked it over my small stove. That simple meal was the best I'd had in weeks. The experience reminded me that life could still be lived, not merely endured. I spent the following day repeating the process, catching more fish, salting some of it for later. The area seemed devoid of infection, though I remained vigilant. Perhaps the forest density deterred large hordes, or the region was simply too remote to attract them. On the evening of my second day at the lake, I decided to try the shortwave radio again, hoping to catch any transmissions. I set up my portable antenna near the cabin, scanning through frequencies. For a long time, only static greeted me. Then, faintly, I picked up a voice. The signal was weak, dropping in and out, but I caught enough words to understand it was someone broadcasting from further north. They mentioned a settlement near a place called Twin Valleys. My curiosity soared. The mention of a real settlement with a name was more concrete than the rumors I'd heard in passing. I jotted down the frequency and the approximate content of the broadcast, determined to investigate further if I could. The next day, I resumed my journey with renewed purpose. I left the rowboat in a safe spot by the cabin, should I ever return, or if another survivor happened by. With a backpack now slightly heavier from salted fish, I pushed deeper into the forest, aiming to find a route that might lead me closer to Twin Valleys. The map from Monroe offered no reference to that name, so it might be further north or known by another label. The terrain proved challenging with steep inclines and dense foliage, but I pressed on. Over the following week, I made steady progress, occasionally finding old footpaths, crossing small rivers, using fallen logs, and even scrambling over boulders in the higher elevations. The nights were colder now. Each dusk, I scouted carefully for a safe campsite, sometimes opting to climb a tree or find a rocky ledge that afforded a broader view. Once I glimpsed a pair of infected, half-hidden among the pines below, wandering aimlessly. They never saw me, and I waited until they disappeared before moving on. Traveling in the wilderness continued to sharpen my instincts. I found myself noticing subtle signs of wildlife, the direction of the wind, the shift of cloud cover that might indicate a coming storm. In many ways, it felt like a reversal of the old normal. Instead of relying on technology and infrastructure, I was relying on the environment, reading its cues, working with its resources. Eventually, I reached a fork in the mountain trails. One path meandered west, the other north. Deciding to stick to my course, I took the northern route, which descended into a broad valley. The scenery changed once again with gentler slopes and more open meadows. At the edge of one such meadow, I found evidence of people. A crude fence made of felled trees stacked to form a barrier. Beyond it, faint smoke curled from a small settlement of cabins or huts. My anticipation grew. This could be Twin Valleys or another community like it. Cautiously, I approached, waving a strip of white cloth I had attached to a branch. After a moment, a figure emerged from behind the fence, clutching a bow. Another person armed with a shotgun stepped into view. They conferred briefly, then motioned for me to come closer. As I neared, I noticed about half a dozen cabins arranged in a circle around a communal fire pit. Gardens enclosed by chicken wire, fences hinted at attempts at agriculture. A few goats roamed near a pen. This place was more organized than the previous camp I'd encountered. A tall man with a lined face and a gray ponytail introduced himself as Garrett. A woman named Sophia stood at his side, holding the shotgun. They greeted me wearily. I introduced myself, removing my respirator so they could see my face. The mention of my years in a bunker sparked curiosity. When they asked if I'd been infected, I assured them I'd never shown symptoms and had followed strict safety protocols. Some of their tension lifted. Garrett explained that this settlement called High Pines had been formed by a handful of families who fled the urban collapse years ago. Over time, they'd fortified it, learning to grow crops suitable for the mountain environment, raising goats for milk and occasional meat. They maintained a rotating guard system to keep out infected or hostile raiders. Their success was modest, but sustainable. About 15 people lived there, including children, a sight that felt like a small miracle in these times. Invited into their communal area, I saw a cooking pot hanging over a fire, tended by a teenager wearing patched jeans and a heavy coat. A couple of younger kids ran around, engaged in a game of tag. The presence of children underscored that some semblance of normal life could still exist in this world. The older members of the group watched the perimeter, scanning the tree line for threats. I felt a surge of cautious optimism. High Pines looked like a place of careful harmony, not cruelty or desperation. Sophia offered me a seat on a bench near the fire. She asked about the path I'd taken, and I recounted highlights of my journey. Several onlookers listened intently. A man named Ellis asked if I'd encountered large hordes of infected. I admitted I'd mostly seen scattered individuals or small clusters. Their expressions indicated that this area had experienced heavier waves in the past. Garrett confirmed that, not long ago, a group of infected roamed through a nearby valley, but the settlement managed to fend them off by luring them into a gully lined with sharpened stakes. We conversed late into the evening. I explained my background in mechanical engineering and my role in the bunker. In turn, they shared the challenges of High Pines, limited medical supplies, the need to rotate farmland to prevent soil depletion, and the dangers of traveling to scavenge from ruined towns. They seemed intrigued by any knowledge I could share about alternative energy systems or water filtration. I offered to look at their homemade windmill, which they used to charge batteries for lighting. Over the next few days, I became an informal guest of High Pines. I fixed an issue with their windmill's rotor blades, adjusting the alignment to reduce friction. I inspected their water filtration setup, a simple charcoal and sand system fed by a nearby stream, and suggested ways to improve it. In return, they gave me a place to sleep in an unused cabin and provided me with fresh produce from their gardens. For the first time since leaving the bunker, I experienced something akin to community life. However, I remained aware of the settlement's limits. Garrett and the others were friendly enough, but also cautious. They had to weigh the risk that I might be a spy, or that I'd bring the infection down upon them. I respected their boundaries, not prying too deeply into their supply caches or personal histories. Occasionally, I caught them huddled in whispered discussions, casting glances in my direction. One evening, Garrett approached me by the communal fire. In a quiet tone, he acknowledged that while they appreciated my help, they were wary of letting an outsider remain indefinitely. I understood. The last thing I wanted was to upset a fragile balance. Secretly, I'd been weighing whether to stay anyway. As peaceful as High Pines seemed, it wasn't the end of my journey. My thoughts kept returning to that faint radio signal mentioning Twin Valleys or the idea of traveling still farther north. We struck a compromise. I'd stay another week or so, helping them upgrade their infrastructure. After that, I'd continue my journey, though they said I'd be welcome to return if things didn't work out elsewhere. The next day, I replaced a broken gear in the windmill with a makeshift alternative, boosting efficiency. I also rigged a small battery bank to store surplus energy so they could power a few LED lanterns if they ever required more advanced gear. During my stay, I observed their security protocols. At night, 2 guards patrolled the fence line in shifts. They used a series of coded whistles, believing that staying quiet was paramount. The fences around the settlement were reinforced with sharpened logs and barbed wire. They'd also built vantage points in the trees where watchmen could spot infected or trespassers from a distance. Children in High Pines learned basic survival skills early on. One afternoon, I saw a girl who couldn't have been more than 10 skillfully snare a rabbit by the stream. The older teens helped with perimeter checks, demonstrating a practical maturity born of hardship. This settlement functioned like a small, self-reliant village bound by shared struggle and a guarded trust. Yet, vulnerabilities abounded. When a child fell ill with fever, they had no advanced medical resources. Herbal remedies, careful observation, and luck were all they could rely on. The fever broke after a couple of days, but the adults were visibly shaken, fearing it might have been spore-related or some other threat. The incident underscored how precarious life here could be, even in a seemingly stable community. At the end of the agreed week, I prepared to leave. Garrett and Sophia gifted me a small bundle of dried vegetables and a tin of goat cheese. Armed with Monroe's old map and new knowledge from High Pines, I plotted a path further north. We exchanged farewells at the gate. Some settlers offered a wave or a polite nod. I sensed gratitude and lingering weariness, which was understandable. In a world reshaped by the spore, trust was both precious and fraught with danger. Stepping back onto the mountain trails, I tested my shortwave radio again. Static greeted me. It wasn't surprising. I was too far from any broadcast source, but the memory of that faint signal whispering about Twin Valleys hovered in my mind. Perhaps I'd meet others who'd heard the same rumor, or discover enclaves forming in these secluded mountains. One truth became clear. There was no turning back. I'd come too far, and something drove me forward. Thus, I moved through each day, step by step, guided by glimpses of hope and the determination not to let all that I've learned go to waste. In the evenings, I record my observations in a notebook, the location of potential shelters, the condition of roads, any sign of infected or friendly settlements. I keep these records in case someone else follows in my footsteps. Some nights, lying under the stars or in a borrowed cabin, I recall the hush of the bunker corridors and the crackle of static from the radio console. I think about Meredith forging her own path. I think about the sabotage that ended our vaccine project, the day Hightower vanished, and all those hours spent transmitting messages into the void. The regrets and lessons gleaned from those memories meld into a quiet resolve. This world, broken as it is, still holds pockets of humanity and resilience. If I can contribute to that, even in small ways, it might be enough of a reason to keep going. And so I continue forging a path through mountains and valleys, forests and deserted roads, always scanning for a sign, any sign, that the spore will not have the final word on Earth's fate. Each sunrise reminds me that even in the bleakest circumstances, life persists. Each time I set up my makeshift antenna, I send out a message. This is Rowan Chambers, formerly of the Hightower Estate bunker, traveling north. If you can hear my voice, know that you are not alone. We are not alone. Keep going. That's all for now. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more unsettling creepypastas. Your support keeps my channel alive. Until next time, stay quiet, stay vigilant, and trust nothing, not even the silence.